Hi, I'm Colette Bancroft, the book editor at the Tampa Bay Times, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the virtual Times Festival of Reading. We'll be taking questions from the audience later in the hour, so please enter your questions in chat for Cynthia and Craig to respond to. Cynthia Barnett is an award-winning environmental journalist who's reported on water and climate change around the world. Her new book, The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans, was published in July. She's also the author of Rain, A Natural and Cultural History, longlisted for the National Book Award, Blue Revolution, Unmaking America's Water Crisis, and Mirage, Florida and the Vanishing Water of the Eastern US. She's written for National Geographic magazine, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. Her numerous journalism awards include a National Sigma Delta Chi Prize for investigative magazine reporting and 8 Green Eye Shades. She teaches environmental journalism at the University of Florida in Gainesville, where she lives with her family. Craig Pittman is a native Floridian, as is Cynthia, by the way. Born in Pensacola. In 30 years at the Tampa Bay Times, he won numerous state and national awards for his environmental reporting. His new book, The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife, is an anthology of 51 of his articles from the 1990s to the present. He's the author of 5 previous books, including the New York Times bestseller, Oh, Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country, and his most recent book before this one, Cattail, The Wild, Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther. He's written for the Washington Post, Smithsonian and Sarasota magazines, the Florida Phoenix, Politico, Crime Reads, and other publications. And the Florida Heritage Book Festival recently named him a Florida literary legend. Pittman is co-host. Pittman is co-host of the Welcome to Florida podcast and lives in St. Petersburg. Welcome to both of you. I'm so glad to see you both. How long have you known each other?
Oh gosh, since the 90s, I guess. Was that when it started?
I think we met in the 90s, and I bet we met in the elevator of the Tampa Bay Times building.
Yes,
when I was working on the top floor, on the 8th floor at Florida Trend. And I think that's probably where we began our friendship.
Yeah.
But I had read Craig's work for a long time before that.
Yeah. Congratulations on both these books. And both of you have published numerous books and of course, articles as journalists. When I talk to novelists about the genesis of a book, they usually say something about, well, I start with a character. This character starts talking to me in my head, or a scene, or, a place, or something like that. What's the genesis for you of a nonfiction book? How do you zero in on a topic that you want to write an entire book about?
Should I start,
Cynthia, after
Craig?
you? Yes, you should.
Yeah, so this one has a very specific genesis. I was actually kicking about for a book to write about the oceans. My previous books were about freshwater and my biography of Rain. And I kind of wanted to complete the hydrological cycle, which I've done now. And I was giving a book talk at the Bailey Matthews National Seashell Museum in Sanibel. And after the talk, I was at dinner with the director, who told me this amazing story about a survey they had done of visitors to find out how much people already knew about seashells. Right. And these surveys revealed that 90% of the respondents did not know that a seashell was made by a living animal. Many people thought they were rocks or stones. And that just jarred me. And that night, I could not fall asleep. I just kept thinking about that. And I think by the time I fell asleep, I had decided that my next book would be about seashells. So it's all about that metaphor, just like we've loved seashells for the beautiful exterior rather than the life inside. We've loved the oceans as this beautiful backdrop of life, this postcard rather than the source of life. And so that just seemed like a really good analogy to me. And came up with the idea that night and worked on it for the next 6 years.
Yeah, that story, you include that story in the book, and it just stopped me cold. When I read that, I like put the book down and thought, no.
And you have to remember that a lot of those people were children, but still, you know, that's pretty concerning.
It's an excuse, but you know, still, I was just floored. But then I started thinking about it, and I think most people, as you said, we sort of take those things for granted. We look at their surfaces, and this book, one thing I love about this book is that it goes below the surface in kind of biological terms and explains the animals themselves, but also in their relations to humans. And I'll come back to that, but I want to let Craig answer my question first. And I also have a kind of related question for him. So Craig, how do you zero in on topics for books?
Well, okay. So for Cattail, it's easier to answer with that one. Cattail, I wanted to write a book about Florida Panthers for 20 years. And, you know, because the characters involved were all very interesting, very unusual people. The plot took all kinds of twists and turns you wouldn't expect, but it didn't have an ending. And I felt like I needed an ending before I could start it. And then about 5 years ago, I got an ending and said, okay, this could be a hopeful thing to end it on. With the state you're in, it had a different genesis. When Oh Florida came out, two things happened when I went around promoting the book. One is people came up and told me their Florida stories, some of which I could repeat, some of which I can't. My favorite one, by the way, is the family who they discovered that their new neighbors were running an illegal nudist bed and breakfast. And the way they found that out was that they gave their kids a trampoline for Christmas. So people would come up and tell me those stories. But then the other thing that happened was people would come up and say, when are you going to write a sequel? You need a sequel. When is there going to be a sequel? You know, when we're going to see Oh Florida 2 Electric Boogaloo or something like that. And I had to tell them, you know, I feel like I've kind of said everything I need to say, but there's so many more wacky stuff happening. It's like, yeah, but, you know, so after writing Cattail, I started thinking, well, how could I do a sequel? Maybe there's a way to do a sequel that's not exactly a sequel. It's more of a son of Oh Florida. Yeah. And so that's what Oh Florida is. That's what the state you're in is. It's a sort of a sequel in that it celebrates that whole, the same sort of spirit of, isn't this a wacky, wild place? And aren't these great stories? And Florida stories, you never run out of Florida stories. And so I pulled it together specifically looking for, I had two criteria. One is good Florida stories that you probably wouldn't see anywhere else, and stories about Florida storytellers. So I could sort of salute the people who came before, including my great uncle Carlisle. So who's the last piece in there.
Yeah.
So that,
piece. Yeah.
So that was sort of my goal with that book.
Yeah. And you're best known and have won many awards for your environmental reporting, but that's not the focus of this anthology. There are some articles that you chose that are related to that, but they're
weird
not
ones.
Weird ones. Yes, weird, but they're not predominantly that. There's a long one, a really mind-boggling one set in a courtroom, in a Pinellas County courtroom. There are, the tales about people rather than that, the kind of thing you're best known for. And I wonder, what was your process in choosing that, to take that tack?
Well, I think people are really fascinating, and our many contradictions and the lies we tell ourselves and things like that, and also what motivates us to get through the day. And so I looked for interesting people. I mean, the very first piece in there, which I think of as sort of the gateway drug to Florida weirdness, is the piece about all the women and some men that dress up as mermaids and try and make a living at that, or at least a good side hustle, pretending to be these mythical creatures. And my favorite one, by the way, is the woman who said she was 47 and said, "Thank God water lifts." So.
And you know what I found myself thinking when I read that? And of course, I'd read it the first time when it, was published as an article. And then when I was reading it again, the book, and there was the guy who's running a business making those mermaid tails that cost thousands.
The Mertailor. Yes.
I found myself thinking, I wonder what the pandemic did to that business. And
the
to
Mertailor is still,
the whole mermaid thing.
I follow several of their accounts on Instagram. They're still out there swimming around. It's not. It didn't discourage them. Let's put it that way.
I'm glad to hear it. Cynthia, let me come back to you. This book goes all over the world, and it travels through time, through eons of time, to tell the story of these extraordinary creatures. I felt like I'd had a graduate course in mollusks when I got to the end of this book, and I've had graduate courses, and this one was more fun than most of them were.
Oh, that's a relief.
But you often bring it back around to Florida. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about a couple of the shells. I see one there behind you, most associated with Florida, and about the stories about them that you tell in the book.
Sure. Well, since you mentioned this one, Colette, this is kind of dirty because I just grabbed it out of my garden right beforehand.
I have one in my garden that looks a lot like that.
Yeah. So this is Florida's state shell, the Horse Conch. And just to go back to your point about going around the world, this is a global book, but in thinking about how to organize it, I thought about Florida being my home, and specifically Southwest Florida being my home was the apex. So this is the apex of a seashell. And this is where the little tiny marine mollusk begins building the shell when it is just a tiny baby. Mm-hmm. This is always the oldest part of the shell. So I thought of this part as like Sanibel or Southwest Florida, and then I would wind around the world to tell the story. So I wind geographically, and then, as you said, in time. But to help ground readers in the story, I chose 12 iconic seashells to tell these stories about. And the Horse Conch actually wasn't one of those shells, but I grabbed it because it is Florida's state shell, and it's a really important animal and an imperiled animal, which is something I'm writing about right now. But I'll mention a couple other seashells in the book. One is the lightning whelk. I love this beautiful shell. And the cool thing about lightning whelks, one of the many cool things about them, it's a left-handed shell. Most seashells open on the right. This part, which is called the aperture, is on the right. On the lightning whelk, it's on the left. And that may be one of the reasons they were so revered by Native American people. And the thing I love about the lightning whelk chapter was my ability to tell the story of Florida's Gulf Coast Native people. I was born in Fort Myers, and one thing I was thinking about the other day, I drove by the shell factory. I used to go to the shell factory when I was a kid, and I was thinking at that moment, I wish I would have thought of this line for the book, but before there was a shell factory in Fort Myers, there was a shell work factory in Fort Myers. And so, we just had these extraordinary cities of shell on the Florida coastline before the shell mounds were torn down to build roads and, for construction fill and so on. So I really loved the lightning whelk for being able to tell that story. And the other neat thing about that story is that lightning whelks were really important in the interior of the United States. So in places like Cahokia, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Gulf Coast, Florida, these lightning whelks made their way to Cahokia, which is where modern day St. Louis is. And they were super important there too. So I love that seashells can tell so many stories, I came to see them as fact checkers, like the world's great fact checkers. They tell more accurate stories of humans than the humans who wrote those down. And they're also very accurate tellers of science, both past science and, projecting future trends. And then I'll just show you one more quick shell, is the beautiful Queen Conch, which we have unfortunately fished out of the Florida Keys, but which still thrives in parts of the Caribbean. It's being fished out in the Caribbean too. So, and the story I love about the Queen Conch, one of the stories is the fact that, that too was a shell that was really important to the native people of the Caribbean, the Taino people. And it's sort of been, all of these shells, like everything else, were co-opted by the colonists. And the Queen Conch is called a Queen Conch because Queen Victoria loved it so much, and the jewelry that was made from the conch shell. So in every case, I try to tell the scientific stories, but also really ground them in the humanity, and especially some of those untold stories.
Yeah, and I love that about the book. As I said, there's that really great, education about the creatures, the shells, and the creatures that build them. But you always connect them with those human stories, and they're unexpected. They're fascinating stories.
I'll never look at a Shell Oil logo the same way again.
I know, that's an incredible story, and I'd never heard that story before. And,
me neither.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah. So, or the Edgar Allan Poe story.
Yeah, for the audience, I don't want to give this away because I hope you will all read the book, but Shell Oil, the corporation we know so well, begins as a teeny tiny seashell curio shop in the East End of London, dating to the 1830s, and a little seashell shop dealer named Marcus Samuel, who is selling seashells in Victorian times, and including during Queen Victoria's time, who helps make these conchs so popular. And that became one of the largest oil companies in the world. And you'll have to read the book to find out all the connections that you can imagine I make there.
It's an amazing story. I mean, it just kept taking another twist, and just like a shell, another twist. It's amazing. Do we know why lightning whelks are left-handed?
Scientists are intrigued and consternated by that question. There is a suspicion that they evolved left-handedness to protect themselves from a particularly aggressive right-handed crab. Right clawed crab, right? But that can't explain the whole story, because there are some left-handed shells that evolved in parts of the world where there aren't those kinds of crab predators. But shells are generally the way they are to protect themselves from their predators. So all the things we love about the shells, their spikes and their spines and their twists and turns, those were adaptations to their predators to help protect themselves. So it's probably the reason for the left-handedness, but they don't know exactly the predator situation that they evolved to deal with.
Yeah.
So there's not a sinister reason for the left-handedness.
Oh. I wondered how far he could get into the conversation without a pun.
He's so good. He's so good.
19. That is a good pun. It is a good pun.
I've been good.
Craig, last night when I heard that Winter the dolphin, Florida's most famous dolphin, had died.
Since Flipper.
Had died at the Clearwater Aquarium. I thought about Love to Death, the article about Beggar the dolphin, Sarasota Bay, that you include in the state you're in. Can you talk about what the lives and deaths of those two dolphins say about our relationship to the species. And
well, okay, let me think about this. Generally, people have the wrong idea about dolphins because dolphins appear to smile. They think they're friendly and cheerful and, sort of happy-go-lucky creatures, that love to dance through the wake of ships and things like that. And they're not. They're wild animals. And the dolphin smile is very misleading. In the case of beggar got that name because it begged for food from all the the tourists and so forth that would come through Sarasota Bay. They would see this dolphin pop up next to their boat and be all smiling at them and looking for food, and so they would throw food to beggar, or they'd throw other things to beggar that were not food that beggar would eat. And sometimes if they didn't throw things at beggar would trail their fingers too close, beggar would take a bite out of them. And there's the story includes one lady who had a pretty serious encounter with beggar that that led to serious medical complications. So I guess sort of the thing I learned from writing about beggar that I guess applies to winter is we tend to think of the animals as a backdrop for our own human stories. We tend to think of them as, a part of our own, Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom story, but they're not. They're separate. They're not even thinking about us most of the time, and we are constantly trying to draw them into our stories. Now with winter, human intervention saved Winter's life, that they came up with a prosthetic tail for Winter, but then they turned Winter into an entertainment device as well, not just being there at the Clearwater Marine Aquarium, but also becoming the star of this movie. How many movies were there? There's like 3 or 4. I think there was Winter versus Sharknado or something like that. I don't remember. Anyway, but again, we just have this idea that we try to commodify nature and turn it into an entertainment thing. I've been kind of poking around with the idea of writing something about reality TV and python hunting and how that's been turned into this entertainment thing, this horrible invasive species problem that we have in Florida, and people are going out there and turning it into a thing that keeps folks entertained with like Guardian of the Glades, Dusty Wildman Crumb, who likes to run around barefoot in the Everglades with a body cam on and show people how he catches snakes. It's like, that's not really solving the problem, and you can't really say it's raising awareness of the problem. It's just, it's entertaining TV. And I'm not sure what else I can say about that.
I think reality TV may be one of the most dangerous invasive species in Florida.
Well, we should stop calling it reality because it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of it's scripted.
Exactly. Yeah.
It never was. Reality with quotation marks. But when you research a book, even when you research an article as a journalist, you always end up with so much more than you can use. Most of the time, you have more material than you can get into an article or even into a book. And I was curious about, as many as fascinating facts and stories as you included in this book. What was the most interesting thing or the weirdest thing that you had to leave out? And Craig, you have an anthology with 51 pieces, and that's a lot.
Should have been 52. I should have made it 52. I wasn't thinking that could be one a week. You could read it over a year.
A year with Craig Pittman. But I can recall months at the times where it seemed like you had written 51 articles in a month. And so you obviously had a much larger pool to choose from. So I wonder if each of you could tell me the thing it most pained you to leave out.
Cynthia, you go first.
Colette, if it's all right with you, the thing that really stands out to me the most is a part that I cut from the Rain book that I regret to this day. I think what I cut from the seashell book were the right cuts. You're right. There's a lot of things we fall in love with, but I think generally the trims are good, and the book gets better and better the more you trim. But with the
Murder Your Darlings.
Yeah, Murder Your Darlings. The hardest thing for students to learn, by the way. But with the rain book, I had what I still feel is a really beautiful scene about some great apes in Africa doing what can only be described as a rain dance, just an absolute joyous dance together in a rainstorm, after a dry time. Mm-hmm. And this was a behavior described by Jane Goodall. And it was one of those, I love those connecting stories, stories that connect us to the world around us. And that was just a gorgeous story. And I cared so much about the story that I spent weeks on the writing, getting it just right. And at the end of that process, it had to go. It did not really fit in well with the book. And I hated cutting it. And now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I should turn back to it and see if I can publish that somewhere. But you're right. We all sort of have a story that is out there that hasn't seen the light of day. And that's mine.
Yeah. Yes. I hope you find a place for it. It sounds,
Thanks.
I want to read.
Like Cynthia, my big problem with cutting was not with either of these current books, but with Florida. When I first turned in the manuscript, the editor said, well, this is terrific, but it's 100 pages too long. You need to cut it. And so out went the guy who had a love affair with a dolphin. And that's on YouTube if you're really interested. Out went the skunk ape, out went a whole bunch of other stuff. And I really regretted leaving out the skunk ape. So the skunk ape shows up in Cattail. Yeah. And I was pretty happy I was able to work him in there. And pops up in the python hunting section of the state you're in also. Right. So, yeah. I hope I have made up for that omission.
Yes. Yes, it's a shame to write about Florida and not include the skunk ape.
Absolutely.
Or the Barden booger, which is our other Yeti. I think Florida is the only state that has two Bigfoot relatives. Or
What's
big feet.
The distinction between them?
Well, the skunk ape, obviously, it's right in the name. The skunk ape stinks. That's the big difference. The Barden booger is in Central Florida, skunk ape down in Southern Florida, and smells like rotten eggs. So
Barden booger moved up to Central Florida to get away from his cousin.
Probably so. But they both tend to exist mainly in blurry photos and souvenir T-shirts. So that's one thing they have in common.
And stories told in bars, I think. Another place they exist. Well, I want to ask you both before we start taking some questions from the audience. What are you working on next?
Cynthia?
My new idea is not really ready for prime time, but I will say that I'm sort of intrigued with this idea. You hear so many experts say human beings are the only people who tell stories, right? I mean, the only creatures who tell stories. What distinguishes us from all other life is that we are the storytellers. And I find it interesting in the context of what Craig was talking about earlier with animals and how we view animals. And I've been doing some research on some animals that it could be argued tell stories in their own particular way. So I can't make any guarantees that this would be my next book, but it's certainly something I'm thinking about and researching. So if anyone has any ideas about animals that tell stories, I would love to hear them.
That's great. That's great. Craig?
Well, I find I'm writing lots of stuff about snakes lately, and I suspect that's next on my list. I did a big piece for Flamingo magazine looking back at Ross Allen, who was the snake man of Silver Springs. And
I loved that piece. I loved that piece so much, Craig, and I'm so glad you're going to write about snakes. And I was just devastated to read the details about rattlesnakes in that piece. So I'm very excited to hear this.
Yeah.
Just to briefly, the continuing storyline in the story was about how Ross Allen took Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings out rattlesnake hunting with him because she was deathly afraid of snakes, number one, but also because he wanted her to write about him because he loved getting publicity for his snake shows at Silver Springs. And so they went out, and she stuck to it stuck right behind him the first day. She didn't want to make a move without him. She was so frightened. And he was very casually picking up snakes all over the place and dropping them in the bucket in the back of his truck. And then overnight, he shows her how to catch non-venomous water snakes and gets her to hold one. And she kind of thaws a little bit towards the snakes. And then the next day, she actually catches one on her own. And, she has trouble putting it in the truck, but she does catch one. And then she wrote about how she went back home and she felt less afraid of snakes, to the point where when she found a cottonmouth in her bathroom one night, instead of running screaming out of the bathroom, instead she pinned it under a Sears Roebuck catalog and then beat it to death with a copy of The Yearling.
It's such a great story.
Which when I read that, I thought, I wonder what book I would use.
Yeah.
Probably the Power Broker.
Yeah. Yes, that would be a good choice. That would be a good choice. But we don't have Sears Roebuck catalogs anymore. So the bigger question is, what would you pin the snake down with?
I think I need 2 copies of the Power Broker.
Yeah, one to pin him down and one to beat him down. One more thing I want to ask you before we take audience questions. You've written a number of books, and you've promoted books through the usual channel of book tours. Doing book signings, doing readings, doing talks, appearances all over the state and beyond. And for these books, and Craig, I think also with Cattail to a degree, you dealt with promoting a book during a pandemic. Yeah. And I wonder if both of you could talk a little bit about what that's been like.
With Cattail, I was very lucky. I got 2 months in before the pandemic shut everything down. And initially everything just got canceled, period. And so I was trying to plug a book with no appearances whatsoever, which is not easy. But then Zoom, thank God, popped up and people started doing stuff virtually. So, the good side of that is you don't have to get in a car and drive anywhere. But the bad news is you're not there to sign books, so people are less inclined to buy them. So, and in fact, a couple of bookstores told me, well, we tried doing Zoom and people just weren't buying the books, so we don't think it's worth doing anymore. So that's kind of disappointing. Thanks to the positivity rate dropping below 5%, things are starting to open up a little bit more now. And in fact, I'm actually doing an in-person appearance tomorrow in Punta Gorda at Copperfish Books. And they've already got about 35 people signed up for that. But I'll still be masking up and staying 6 feet away from everybody, even though I'm fully vaxxed. But it's been difficult. And I miss that direct communication with the readers. I miss having people come up and talk to me afterwards and tell me, oh, I really like that, and it reminded me of this story from my life, and things like that.
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, the thing that is so different about transitioning, I transitioned from, traditional newspaper journalism and then magazine journalism to books. And the lovely part of that transition for me, the most meaningful thing for me is this: even though my audience is larger, I have a much greater intimacy with readers. And it's just been remarkable and something I wasn't expecting. So when I was working in the media, or there was always this distance you feel between yourself and your audience. And that is sort of eliminated with books, especially at live events, which became really important for me with all of my books. So it was difficult to have this. Came out in July. I had a book tour set up, and then the variant hit just at the same time. And I think I did 3 live events before everything else was canceled. And that has been difficult. And it's not just the sales, it is also that, just like Craig was describing, this wonderful sense that you get from readers who want to come tell you some extraordinary story from their lives, that was sparked by your book. So I'm really happy to have a few things back on the calendar. I had a great event last Friday night with Friends of Lovers Key State Park down in Fort Myers. And then next weekend I'll be in Miami at the book fair. So it's like I'm trying to get not too excited, but it sounds like things are going to open back up a little bit for us.
Yes. We're all hoping.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, knock wood. All right. Well, let's take some questions from readers. Helen, do you have some questions for us?
Yes, we do. This one is for Cynthia. It says, do you envision that your recent works will have a positive impact on your readers to appreciate the earth and the ocean?
I do. I really think of seashells as ambassadors. As Craig knows, when you cover the environment as an environmental reporter, which we both were before, you tend to preach to the choir too much. And I don't care as much about that. I'm not really writing for people who already know everything about water or oceans or climate change or whatever it is. I have an idea in my mind of an audience that I think of as the caring middle, like very much like people in my family who they may not be environmentalists or think of things with the same ethos that I do, but once they know something, they really care about it. And so that's how I see seashells, and that's how I saw, water and weather as well. So I definitely hope that I can help, change the environmental ethic in a broader audience.
This question is for Craig. How did you develop your sense of humor, and where does it come from?
I grew up in Florida. I always say, if you grew up in Florida, you never suffer from an irony deficiency. And, there was crazy stuff happening all the time. It's just, I didn't realize that it was special to Florida. I thought every place in America, there were politicians nicknamed the Bandy Rooster who made their money selling hula hoops, or that there were houses out at the beach with a UFO on top, which, Pensacola Beach has one of those. I thought that was completely normal. And then, when I went to college in Alabama, I realized, it's just Florida that's like that. My first sort of real taste of how weird Florida can be came while I was in college. I was while I was home for summer break, the legislature accidentally deregulated the psychology industry, so that the examining board, the licensing board, went out of business. They sunsetted it by accident, and so anybody who wanted to be a psychologist could just go buy an occupational license at the county for like $10. So people were buying them for their, for their dogs, for their kids. So I went and bought one for myself and took it back with me to the college campus and hung it up over my desk at the student paper. And I had found a sign that said, newcomers, please sign in with the nurse. New patients, please sign in with the nurse. And then I put my license, and people would come by and look at it and go, is that real? Are you really a psychologist? And I said, that's the way we roll in Florida.
Great. This is, I think, could be for both. During the pandemic, have you found that this has given you more time to write, or have you found the time to be too isolating?
Ooh, I have a lot more time to write. On the other hand, I have fewer opportunities to go out and report, which is somewhat limiting. There are trips I would like to take. There are reporting jaunts that I have in mind, but I have been very cautious about doing that just because I'm cautious about getting exposed to, to the virus. So it's sort of been a mixed blessing. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, especially when the pandemic first hit, I was finishing my book and finishing revisions, and it was so much harder to write. There was ostensibly more time, but there really wasn't for me because it meant my teenagers were home all the time and not at school, and that made it very difficult. And I will also say that the stress of COVID and the stress of the political situation surrounding COVID made it much more difficult for me to write. So I was very happy when I finally got it finished.
This is another question that I think could be both for you. So I'll stick with you for now, Cynthia. Did you always know you're going to be an author? And what is your writing process like?
Yeah, so I grew up knowing I wanted to be a journalist. I was the editor of my Girl Scout troop newspaper beginning in 5th grade. I always wanted to be a journalist. So I did want to be a writer, but much more specifically, I feel even now as a book author, I would define myself as a journalist. And my writing process is there's so much that could be said about this, but I will say that I write at 5 a.m. That's when I start writing. That's really important for me. And again, I think that came from being a mother and needing to find the time before the kids woke up, and that still works for me. So that's still the way I do it.
I interviewed Lauren Groff on Monday, Cynthia, and she said exactly the same thing, that she gets up at 5 a.m. and writes.
Yeah, and we live in the...
I thought you were going to say she was the editor of her Girl Scout newspaper.
No, and we both live in the same town, and I think we may have emailed at 5 a.m. before.
I'm sorry, I stepped on your line there. Go ahead.
Oh well, for me, I expected fully to be either a major league pitcher or a fighter pilot, but once I got past the discovery that I wasn't nearly as good at baseball as I thought I was, and that I really didn't want to go where people were shooting at me, it dawned on me that what I really needed to do was become a writer, and specifically I needed to go to school and study journalism, and then used the next 5 years after I graduated to learn everything there was to know about the world in my journalism, and then write the great American novel, and then retire young and, sell the movie rights to Hollywood. And somehow that plan did not work out. I'm still shocked.
Craig, this one's for you too. Out of all the crazy things you've seen here in Florida, what region of Florida would you say is the most insane or the most random?
Pasco. That's an easy one. Pasco County. Pasco, because not only do you have the typical Florida mix of, shady developers and public officials in trouble with the law, but you've got the mafia was a stronghold there. If you've seen Donnie Brasco, a lot of that was originally happening in Pasco County. They have more nudist resorts in Pasco County than anywhere else in the world. It's a sort of the nudist capital of America. And there are just interesting things that happen there. Like there were a group of Wiccans that got into a shootout with their neighbors because their neighbors were convinced they were Satanists. The Ku Klux Klan offered to adopt a highway in Pasco County. And when people objected, they said, no, we won't wear the sheets. We'll wear the yellow vests. It'll be okay. And there's just crazy stuff that happens there all the time. Probably one of the best recent examples being the mayor of Port Richey being arrested for practicing medicine without a license. And the SWAT team went in to get him because he was known to own a lot of guns. And he did indeed end up shooting back at the cops. And so they arrested him. And so a new person stepped in as as sort of the acting mayor. And then he got arrested 20 days later. So they became the only city in Florida that had 2 mayors arrested within a month's time. Only in Pasco County.
Cynthia, this was for you. It's about the environmental changes that have sort of taken place over the last decade here in Florida. And this person wants to know, how do natives who have seen even greater changes in their lifetime stay optimistic and energetic and not heartbroken about what used to be?
Yeah, so I think you will find reporters like me and Craig heartbroken about a lot of things that we've seen change in our lifetimes and in our children's lifetimes. But one thing that I think is very important that I talk with my students about a lot are the incredible ingenuity and positive changes that have happened too over time. So I'll just give you a few examples. You know, the 1960s when sewage poured directly into bays in Florida, when alligators were near extinct, when eagles were near extinct. There are many stories from Florida history and American history. You can look at the plume bird slaughter of the early 20th century. There are all kinds of stories that we can tell and remember about the way things have been in the past that were much worse than they are now. And we came together and there was political will to turn things around. So, you know, the restoration of the Kissimmee River, bringing back plume birds. You know, alligators are doing very well now, as we can see when we look around to any corner. The eagles have come back. And so there is also a lot of triumph. So I would say, do not forget the triumph and remember to celebrate those stories and know those stories. And all of that said, you know, 2022 will be the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act and Florida's water resource law of 1972, which were just these incredibly progressive laws that really changed the health of our waters. And that pendulum is swinging back. You know, things got better and now our waters are going in the wrong direction again. So that political will that we had in the early 70s is sort of needed once again. So I think that's important to talk about those things and the triumphs of the past, but to also think about what we can do now and not sit idly by and let things be destroyed.
I would agree with Cynthia that I think that sometimes as reporters, and I'm guilty of this too, we tend to focus more on what's wrong and we neglect the good stories, the comeback stories. So that's why with Cattail, I really wanted a sort of a hopeful ending to tell people, yeah, at one point in 1995, there were maybe 20 panthers left, and now there are more than 200. So they're not, you know, things are not rosy, but they're doing better than they used to be. And you mentioned about the Kissimmee River. That's a perfect example. Alligators are a great example. They were almost wiped out, and now we have so many that the state actually has this phone number you call for the statewide nuisance alligator program, or SNAP for short. Which anytime somebody tells you bureaucrats don't have a sense of humor, tell them about the SNAP program.
This is a question for both of you. Do you have any favorite authors who write about the natural beauty and life of Florida that inspired your writing?
Cynthia, of course.
Oh, thanks. Well, Craig and I, I'm trying to see if I have this book on my, if I have this book nearby. Craig and I have a bit of a disagreement about who wrote the first ecological novel. And I would attribute it to Zora Neale Hurston and this novel called Seraph on the Swanny. Zora writes beautifully about water in all of her books, but this book in particular is kind of a devastating story about it's actually about white crackers in the Turpentine area of Florida who moved to Central Florida. And it's got a lot of really amazing prose about water and about the environment and about the destruction that's starting to happen. So I'll just throw out the name Zora. There are lots of others I could name, but I'm going to start with her.
It's hard to top Zora. I would argue my part of the argument is I contend it's Flash of Green by John D. Mcdonald, which involves the dredging and filling of a bay and was inspired by something that happened in Sarasota Bay, since John D. Mcdonald lived in Sarasota. An awful lot of his books work in environmental messages. And there's a piece in the state you're in that actually talks about John D. Mcdonald and his environmental activism and quotes Cynthia in that piece.
Oh yeah, I am quoted. And I will say, I love the cover of Craig's book, and a John D. Mcdonald book is in Craig's hand on this cover. If you look closely, yeah.
All right, one last question for both of you. Would either of you consider writing a book on recent Florida politics or in COVID?
No.
No, but somebody should do something about how Florida has handled COVID, because it's a wild ride. It really is. I mean, and let me just, salute the Tallahassee Democrat for stories it's been doing about the fast tracking of the hiring of the new Surgeon General, who
absolutely
got his medical license in 2 days.
Fast tracked at the university where I teach as well. Fast tracked to the faculty, which has been a pretty devastating story here in Gainesville. But I quickly said no, because as important as I see that story, I feel that there are so many political books and so many political reporters, and there is a problem in our industry of a kind of a pack mentality where you'll have 100 reporters working on the same story in Washington or Tallahassee, when there is so much else out here on the landscape, the kinds of things that Craig and I try to cover. So I feel that the world could use a little less political reporting and more kind of humanist reporting. So that's why I flinched a bit to think of the idea of writing a political book. But I admire those who do.
Yeah. But before we wind up, I just wanted to mention, we talked about this before we started, but I'm actually wearing this shirt in tribute to Cynthia because she gave it to me. It's one of the old DOT toll taker shirts that actually has destinations on it like Yeehaw Junction. And Cynthia knew I'd always wanted one, and she sent it to me last year. So
yes, Craig has a well-known collection of Florida themed shirts. And
yeah, yes. I'm really happy to see you wearing it. It's great to see.
It is. All right. Well, are we wrapped up, Helen, for audience questions? Okay.
I think so. There's one more that's actually for you, Colette. It says that during your interview with Kathy Loper, you said something in Cynthia's book made you say, "Wow, I didn't know that shells could do that." What was that?
Could be any number of things.
Could be any number of things. But you know what I was thinking of when I said that? That
was it poison?
The cone snail poison.
Yeah,
that surprised me. That really did surprise me.
Yeah, I think that was what I was thinking of.
Yeah. So cone snails are make toxins to paralyze their prey before they gobble them down, and some of these toxins are poisonous enough to kill a person and have killed a person. One cone is nicknamed the cigarette cone because a human was said to have about as much time as they need to smoke a cigarette before dropping dead after being stung by a cigarette cone. But the beauty of that story, back to the ingenuity of humans and nature, the beauty of that story is that scientists have used the venom of cone snails to make some incredible pharmaceuticals, including a painkiller that is as strong as morphine without the addictive qualities. So these animals are just miraculous in so many ways.
Yeah, that is what I was thinking of, is that that shell, that animal. And also I'm really surprised nobody ever worked that, you know, that cigarette shell into like a James Bond novel. It seems perfect.
I'm sure Tim Dorsey will at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is the perfect James Bond detail though, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to smoke a cigarette and die.
All right.
As I struck my cat.
Well, thank you both so much. It's been delightful to talk to you. This would only be more fun if we were all in the same room.
Yes, maybe next year. Maybe next year. Thank you for inviting us.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you so much to our audience for watching and for having such great questions. Remember, the festival will continue tomorrow and Sunday. Tomorrow we'll have Michael Carita talking about his horror novel, Where They Wait, which will make you want to throw your smartphone off the skyway. And on Sunday, we'll have Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Louise Erdrich, the great Louise Erdrich, with her brand new novel, The Sentence. You can sign up for both of those events at festivalofreading.com. Thanks also to Helen Freund for her help with producing today's discussion. And Craig and Cynthia, thanks so much. It's been so great to see you.
Our pleasure. Thanks again, Helen. Thanks, Colette.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you next time. Bye-bye.